One of the highlights of the American Super Bowl is the halftime commercials. And this year, they certainly didn't disappoint. Here's a great ad put together by the Jeep motorcar company featuring Harrison Ford. Just watch this. I think one of the best ads ever produced.
Longest thing we ever do is live our lives. But life doesn't come with an owner's manual. Might have been nice, huh? But that means we get to write our own stories. Freedom is yes, or no, or maybe. Freedom is for everybody, but it isn't free. It's earned. There are real heroes in the world, but not the ones in the movies. Real heroes are humble. They're not driven by pride. Pride is a terrible driver. Freedom is the roar of one man's engine and the silence of another's. Freedom is the ability to inspire. The most sacred thing in life isn't the path. It's the freedom to choose it. You don't have to be friends with someone to wave at them. We won't always agree on which way to go. But our differences can be our strength. So choose, but choose wisely. Choose what makes you happy. My friends, my family, my work make me happy. This Jeep makes me happy, even though my name is... That's my owner's manual. Get out there, write your own.
Well, that's a pretty good commercial. And some great lines in there. Freedom is the roar of one man's engine and the silence of another.
Freedom is the roar of one man's engine and the silence of another's.
The most sacred thing in life is the freedom to choose.
The most sacred thing in life isn't the path. It's the freedom to choose it.
But unfortunately, when it comes to motorcars and Jeep motorcars, here in Australia, men like Chris Blackout Bowen are taking away that freedom to choose. With their new taxation system, taxation, levy, fine, penalty, call it whatever you want. But it is a tax that will go on top of motor cars, especially Jeep cars. So let's just go through how that freedom to choose, the freedom to choose whether we want a petrol car, a diesel car, a hybrid car, or an electric car, is being taken away and being skewed by government with this new taxation regime. Now, firstly, every single car on the Australian market is given a rating of the CO2 it emits in grams of CO2 per single kilometre travelled. Now, remember, when we are talking about CO2, because we're talking about the not the dirt and the pollution that comes out, but we're talking about the same type of bubbles in the drink. So there you can see that that is all the CO2. That is what is being taxed here. And the taxation rate is $100 per gram above the government's threshold. So for example, we say a can of Coke, they say with the CO2 in it, and the production is around about 170 grams for a single can of Coke. But here we are with the government deciding to charge us $100 a gram for every gram above their threshold. Now the threshold that they've set decreases every year. Now there's two different schedules, type 1 and type 2. Most vehicles come under the type 1 schedule, but vehicles, very large, heavy four-wheel drives over 2,400 kilometres, go into the type 2 schedule. But most of Jeep's vehicles appear to fall under that 2,400 kilo threshold and therefore would be taxed under the type 1 schedule. The thresholds start at 140 grams, 141 grams this year, they go down next year to 117. In 2027, they go down to 92 grams of CO2 per kilometre. 2028, 68, and 2029, 58. So how much extra tax is Chris Bowen and Mr. Albanese going to put on Jeeps from these Jeeps cars that Harrison Ford was advertising in that magnificent ad? Well, I've done some numbers here. Jeep's Gladiator vehicle has a rating of 288 grams of CO2 per kilometre. So in 2 years' time, in 2027, that against the threshold of 92 grams of CO2, we're looking at 196 grams above that threshold. So therefore, the penalty, the tax, the fine, whatever you want to call it, will be $19,600 that an Australian will be levied on top of for buying a Jeep Gladiator. In 2028, the fine goes up to $22,000. And in 2029, the fine jumps again to $23,000. That is a levy that is imposed upon Jeep that they will simply pass on to Australian consumers to have to pay this. Americans won't pay this. President Trump has wiped all these absurd levies and extra taxes and rebates and things to do with electric cars. He's obliterated them all. But here we have in Australia, for that Jeep Gladiator, in 2029, the tax will be $23,000 additional that you'll have to pay. That will be the fine or the levy imposed on top of that car. And it doesn't just stop in 2029. After 2029, the minister, whoever that will be in the next government, gets to reschedule those targets by themselves through regulation to even lower them further. And the $100 per gram is also indexed to CPI. So we say by 2029 that $23,000, that's without the indexation on it. There'll be an index for inflation, so it'll be even higher than that. Then we come to Jeep's Grand Cherokee, which has a rating of 236 grams to 243 grams of CO2 per kilometre travelled. Here we go. So the tax, fine, penalty, whatever you want to call it, in 2027 on a Jeep Grand Cherokee will be $14,400. In 2028, it will be $16,800. And in 2029, an extra $17,800. And again, it will be more than that because those amounts will be indexed, those increases will be indexed to CPI. The Jeep Wrangler, well, that has a rating of 225 grams of CO2. So the tax, additional tax that Labor and Chris Bowen is going to impose on a Jeep Wrangler in 2027 will be $13,300. In 2028, it'll be $15,700 extra. And in 2029, it'll be $16,700 penalty imposed upon Jeep for every Ford Wrangler that they sell. Now, even if you think this is a good idea, and oh yes, this will force people to buy more fuel efficient cars. Well, even hybrid cars are caught under this new taxation scheme. Now, Jeep have a hybrid vehicle called Compass, and it's rated at 116 grams of CO2 per kilometre. So even that hybrid car faces fines and penalties under this new system in Australia. So we look at the penalty that will be payable. 2027, a $2,400 penalty. 2028, $4,800, and 2029, $5,800 penalty imposed upon a hybrid car. We should have the freedom to choose in this country whatever car we like to drive. The government should not be in there putting these restrictions and penalties on one type of vehicle, whether they be petrol, diesel or hybrid, to favour them over electric vehicles. This policy is simply against that freedom to choose. And worst of all, even if you're a believer that these CO2 bubbles in my Coke cause bad weather, If you're an avid believer of that, this policy of lower emission standards does nothing to that, because it makes no account, firstly, for the added CO2 emissions that go into manufacturing these electric cars. These electric cars take up to 50%, up to 100% more CO2 emissions in their manufacture, because they've got the electric engines that have to be produced, heavier weight, and none of that is taken into consideration. We've seen studies from Volkswagen that show in Australia here, you will never offset those additional manufacturing emissions. So if you're charging an electric car on the grid here overnight in Queensland, New South Wales or Victoria, you'll never offset the higher manufacturing emissions that go into that electric car. So you actually, by buying an electric car, you're actually overall increasing CO2 emissions, which will never offset those manufacturing emissions. Secondly, we know the real drive behind these so-called new emission standards is to make cars more and more expensive, to force people off the road and onto an electric bus.
Why would you own a car? You might own a car like maybe some people own a horse. You know, they might take a ride on the weekends or something. I think that's where the world is going, is that people will not own cars.
These new emission standards will push up the price of motoring for motorists. They will make overall new cars more expensive. They'll increase the insurance costs, because we have seen how much higher the insurance costs are of electric cars in your running costs. And the crazy thing about it, when it comes to pollution, these new so-called emission standards will actually increase urban pollution. What many people don't realise today, that the modern petrol or diesel engine is so efficient that there are very few dirty particulate emissions coming out of the tailpipe. Most of the pollution from a modern car is from the wear and tear of the tyres, not from the tailpipe. So as the tyres wear down, all that sort of black rubbery substance wears down into fine particulate matter, goes up into the atmosphere, it wears down the roads. So the heavier your car is, the more pollution that you're going to kick up into the atmosphere through your tyres and through road wear. And we know that these electric cars are 300 to 400 kilograms heavier than the equivalent petrol or diesel car. So that extra weight puts more wear and tear on the tyres, more wear and tear on the roads. It kicks up more particulate matter and pollution into the atmosphere. You cannot come up with a more daft policy. But where are my old friends in the Liberal Party on this? They should be in there screaming the house down about this, how it's going to push up the cost of motoring, how it especially disadvantages people in the outer suburbs and in rural areas and regional areas and remote areas of Australia, that simply an electric car is completely impractical for them. They should be out there talking about this, explaining to Australians how this new tax regime is going to force up the cost of motoring and reduce your freedom to choose. But we're hearing nothing from the Liberal Party about this. So you do have freedom to choose. If you want that government, if you want big government to take away your freedom to choose what type of car you buy, if you want big government to come in and put all these new taxes and new fines and penalties of up to $10,000, $20,000 on the cars Australians like to buy, well, go ahead and just continue to vote for the Labor Party, the Liberal Party, the Greens or the Teals, because they are pushing that. If you think this policy is a complete nonsense like I do, come and join the Libertarians, come and join us, because we will fight to repeal this ridiculous vehicle emission standards, counterproductive, adding the cost to motoring in Australia. It has to go in its entirety. But we've got to fight for it. As what they say in that commercial, freedom doesn't come for free. It's only if enough Australians will stand up and fight against this ridiculous new tax on cars that we will be able to again restore the freedom of choice in this country on the type of car that we buy without big government interference.